Hello, I'm your host Grayson Brulte. Welcome to another episode of SAE Tomorrow Today, a show about emerging technology and trends in mobility with leaders and innovators to make it all happen. On today's episode, we're absolutely honored to be joined by Jessica Caldwell, Head of Insights at Edmunds. On today's episode, we discuss the current state of the electric vehicle market and the impact that high interest rates are having on electric vehicles. We hope you enjoy this episode. Jessica, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you here. The auto market has highs, it has lows, and has everything in between. A lot of focus now is on electric vehicles in the EV market. You do a lot of really great research at Edmunds. For the record, Edmunds is an awesome company. What is the current state of the EV market?
Well, it's a bit turbulent right now. I would say that what we have seen in 2024 is a bit of a stagnation. There still is some growth, but it is definitely slower than what we have seen over the past few years, where everyone just kind of expected it to grow quickly. And, although it has, it's just been at a much slower pace. But it feels like we're kind of hit this inflection point where it's sort of like, well, what's next? We have a lot of early adopters that have been excited about the technology that have bought vehicles. We have a lot of people that live in urban areas with easy access to good infrastructure. They have bought vehicles. So it's like the next frontier is more of the regular, everyday, mass market, suburban car owner and car shopper. So how do we get those folks excited for this next frontier of cars? And I feel like that's where the issue is that a lot of electric vehicles maybe don't work for these people. And it's not just about price. Price, of course, is a big concern, but it is also about, infrastructure. People have, concerns about battery longevity as well. So I think kind of getting this more pragmatic, very practical shopper that is not easily wowed by having the latest and greatest, it is tough. And that was always going to be tough for this market. I think we were fooling ourselves if we were thinking that that wasn't going to happen, because it happens with every technology. And so I feel like we're kind of at that point where it's like, okay, now this has to get a lot more mainstream. And that is going to be challenging for all automakers that are in this space.
Is charging anxiety still an issue when there's a potential buyer or leasee looking to either buy or lease an electric vehicle?
It is. I mean, of course, ranges have definitely gone up a lot over time. And when you think realistically for most people's lives, the ranges out there are probably fine. But I think what we tend to do, especially, as Americans, we think about that one time that we do something that's just out of the ordinary when we want to drive across the country or we want to go on a long road trip. And, you hear stories about someone who got stranded and it just becomes sort of like that urban myth that you're like, oh no, this is going to happen to me. So I think people do still have range anxiety. That comes up as one of the top concerns for people that don't want to buy an electric vehicle when we survey them. That's still always top 5 is range anxiety. Because I think that we don't just buy cars for our everyday life. We buy them for that, that one time that we want to, haul something. I mean, so many people buy SUVs and trucks that never probably use them functionally. And the same thing with EVs. It's like, well, sure, the 200, 300 is great for me most days. But what about if I want to just get up and drive across the country one day? That's going to be challenging. We never do it, but we still think about it when we buy a vehicle.
Is there any hesitation to either purchase or lease an electric vehicle now because they're changing to the NACS, the Tesla standard, where I got to wait for the new one. I don't want to use that old charging technology. I've heard all those horror stories. I want to use the Tesla ones. Is that leading to any sort of a slowdown since we are going through that massive plug change?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's going to change anyone's mind per se. I think if you are like, I'm going to buy an electric vehicle, I don't think that necessarily is going to be the thing that's just going to completely throw you off course, especially with, price cuts and incentives and everything that's out there nowadays. But I think it does give, people room for pause. But it also, I think, what this does more is it kind of hurts the psychology of more of the mass market shopper who thinks there's different plugs, like what, like they're changing standards. Like, what's going on? This is already overly complicated. I don't need another job to figure out how to drive my car. I'm not even going to bother with that. So I think when there is that type of uncertainty around logistical issues of owning an EV, I think it probably hurts the people that are kind of on the cusp that are thinking about, should I do this? Because, let's be honest, nobody wants to sit around and figure out how to do all of these things and, come up with all these new tasks and figure out a new relationship with your car. People are busy. They don't, unless you really are into it and enjoy that type of thing. And I'd say there definitely are those people, but, a lot of folks just they want something easy, something that is livable and not very different from what they do now. And I think that's I think that's sort of the psychology problem that EVs have is just that people just assuming that it's going to take a lot of work to own one, and you're going to have to plan, and you're going to have to figure things out, and you just are exhausted. You just clearly just don't have time for it.
How about the psychology of the consistent price cuts where if you buy it one day, literally the next day, it can go down by $3,000, $4,000, and you have a very angry customer. No, I'm going to wait one day because the price is going to go down. What hesitation is that causing? Because it can get up here and get in your head psychologically and start keep bouncing around all day.
Yeah, I mean, at first it wasn't, because it felt like it was sort of like a one-off thing, and now you're seeing price cuts all the time, and I think that is definitely a big issue. And I'm sure you probably have seen those online forums where people are mad because you buy a vehicle and all of a sudden it's lost value and there's literally nothing different about it. So I think that is definitely giving people pause. I think especially Tesla, because Tesla price cuts have been frequent and they've been a bit unpredictable in terms of when they happen. So I think that, we definitely hear that a lot from Tesla owners that are, especially maybe that they bought at the end of like 2022, like that, going into that first price cut that they had. I think it was January of last year. There was definitely a lot of very upset customers during that time frame. It was like, like how does this happen? Like, how did this happen to me type of a thing. But yeah, it's something that you kind of have to, be a bit weary about, and, understandably so.
How about if you look at the higher end electric vehicle market, there's diminishing value. There's one OEM, I'll be respectful, not name names, on average, have lost $100,000 in value. Super high-end electric car in 1 year. No problem. It's all over Reddit. People are furious. Not to mention the vehicle has electrical issues. Does that start to... So obviously you have the Model 3 on one end of the market, and then you have the higher-end $160,000 electric vehicle on this end of the market. Price cuts here, devaluation on your investment here. Is that just create the perfect storm where consumers are become even more and more hesitant? Because even the wealthier consumers, they're frugal. And when you see that big of a drop, what happens?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the danger when you are an early adopter and you want to have, I'm sure before that price cut and you were the only person that had that very expensive high-end vehicle, you felt good about yourself and you were thinking, oh, wow, I've got this, everyone else is driving a Model 3 and a Model Y, but yet here I am, I have got this much nicer vehicle. But the flip side is that those sort of drops happen, especially when the vehicle is new, it's unproven. People don't necessarily, maybe the demand is not quite, as high, and it's going to be hard to shift those at some point in time. So I think some of the higher end buyers, they don't necessarily get a lot of sympathy there, but that definitely is, a massive risk when you're buying something that is new. But I think that this is an issue that the EV market has faced, because one of the hot topics right now amongst consumers is like, why am I buying a new EV? I can go buy a used EV because the depreciation has been so, it's just been so high. And if you look at used Model 3s, used Model Ys, they're cheap. They're, you want the $25,000 Tesla, they're for sale now. They're, a year or two old, but they definitely do exist, especially if you're someone that can, also qualify for the tax credit as well. So I think that is an interesting market, because we've talked a lot about prices for EVs and how they should be less expensive. But the reality is that maybe the less expensive EVs will exist as used vehicles, and that will cater to that portion of the market, especially since we're at the point where some of the used EVs are actually compelling vehicles that people want to buy. I mean, I'd say if we were having this conversation 4 years ago and we talked about used EVs, there probably isn't many that either of us would want to drive. But today that's, a bit of a different story. So I think that definitely helps a lot. But that's probably going to be a big concern moving forward, is just that if you're going to try to capture the lower end, how do you compete with the EVs that have lost value? It's sort of like the luxury market, in which it's like, you wait 3 years, vehicles come back off lease. They're real cheap. You look at a BMW X7 now, all of a sudden it seems like almost a bargain compared to new. If you're willing to take one that's a few years old, all of a sudden you can get that aspirational vehicle at a much lower price point. And maybe EVs are similar in that vein, especially since so many now, almost 60% are being leased.
And then you have the 30,000 hertz Tesla vehicles coming on the market. So that's going to put further downward pressure. How aspirational is an electric vehicle for certain customers? Because you mentioned BMW. BMW is a very well-known, very well-documented aspirational brand. How aspirational is an electric vehicle for a consumer?
Depends who the consumer is, because when, we talk to consumers and, we just did a survey for consumers this year, and a lot of people, you ask them the basic questions. Do you like EVs? Do you not like EVs? Are you neutral? Do you just not know enough to have an opinion? There's surprisingly people that strongly dislike EVs. And it is weird because when you think about a vehicle, it's fairly, it's innocuous. It gets you fundamentally from point A to point B. I mean, EVs, you can argue, is a more fun ride from A to B, but whatever, in terms of the actual functionality, it's very, I would say, very innocent. But yet some people have very strong opinions, and they said they will never drive an EV unless it is mandated by the government or automakers don't make you can't buy a used internal combustion engine vehicle. So it definitely feels like EVs have struck a chord somehow with some people, that people have negative feelings towards it. So I'd say that group doesn't feel necessarily particularly aspirational towards EVs, but I think for some people it definitely is more aspirational. I'd say that it's a bit different, I guess, moving forward, especially since most people think, okay, at some point we're all going to be driving EVs. So maybe it doesn't have quite the feeling that it did maybe in 2018, 2019, where it felt so new. But I think there are people that are definitely interested. It's the idea that, like, I think you want to go full EV, but a lot of people just are not quite ready to do that. And I think that's one of the reasons why hybrids are having such a moment right now. They're such in high demand. They're selling at or over MSRP in many cases, because I think people like that idea of environmental sustainability, or at least appearing as such. That is something that is important to them. But logistically, or they're just not set up properly for an EV. So maybe it is aspirational in that way. It's just not ready. They're just not quite ready for it in 2024. Maybe for their next vehicle purchase, 4 years down the road, 5 years down the road, it is something that they'd be willing to do, but it's just not ready quite yet.
Hybrids are interesting. They're a very large OEM. I think 2 or 3 years ago, canceled their hybrid program, and lo and behold, about 6-7 months ago, press release, we're going back into hybrids. And oh, by the way, you can pre-order them. The market for hybrids is booming. Toyota, for all practical purposes, invented the market with the Prius. And when I'll never forget, they put Leonardo DiCaprio in the vehicle, and he goes to the Oscars, and lo and behold, it was the coolest car in Hollywood, and I call it the Leo Mobile, because DiCaprio took it to the Oscars, and everybody had to get a Prius. It didn't matter if you're an assistant or the executive. You drove the same vehicle. How long do you see this momentum in the hybrid market continuing? Is that 4-year period that you mentioned where they might look to go pure electric, or do you see this market potentially continuing to grow past that 4-year mark?
It may go longer than the 4-year mark, just because people just may not be ready. And it seems like, EVs, that timeline for when they are sort of ready to be across the country, it feels like that is a moving target as well. So it does seem like the opportunity for hybrids can be, I'd say, longer than just this 4-year stretch, because that in-between step is needed for a lot of people. When you think about a hybrid, it's, you really do absolutely nothing different than when you have a pure gasoline powered vehicle. And yet people are like, oh, but it's also, part of it's electric. And, I like that. So that messaging just resonates, I think, with people, and it's kind of just gets them to dip their toe into the water of what an electric future could look like. And I think it just depends on the type of consumer it is. But, when you just think about some of the areas in the United States, it's, they're vast. If you think about a place like West Texas, does an EV make sense right now? Or will it even make sense in a few years' time, where you drive very, very long distances through, more isolated areas? It's just like, why does that really work there in a place like that? So it kind of is depending on, where you are at, as well. I would say that it would look a little different if you are ready for an EV versus just a hybrid. But yeah, I mean, who would have thought hybrids were extremely cool, and then they became uncool with EVs, and now they're back again, and you look at how quick they sell. It's like, that vehicle turns up at the dealership lot, and a lot of those vehicles are already spoken for. We see it in the days to turn numbers. They sell extremely quickly.
I think, 60 days on electric vehicles now for some sitting on lots? So you're basically, EVs are flipping real quick. Hybrids are flipping real quick as it compared to an internal combustion and compared to an EV.
Yeah, I mean, you look at hybrids, they're selling on average 20 days. I mean, some hybrids are, you look at something like a Highlander hybrid or a Grand Highlander, it's less than 10 days. And most of that probably is just in paperwork.
Wow.
So but for most of those purposes, those vehicles are sold when they get to the dealership. But yeah, for an EV, I mean, gosh, it's not unusual for them to sit way north of 60 days. It's not unusual for them to be 80 days. I mean, earlier this year at NADA, I heard a lot of dealers grumbling about not being able to move their EVs, even with amazing discounts, even in places like, the Bay Area and San Francisco. A dealer was telling me that he was like, I can't sell EVs in San Francisco. I mean, what is the rest of my dealerships going to look like if I can't do it there?
So you have a dealer in San Francisco that can't sell electric vehicles. You have Ford reporting a loss of $132,000. I repeat, $132,000, not 132. There's 3 zeros after that per electric vehicle sold in Q1 2024. What's going the manufacturer's losing an obscene amount of money. The dealer's losing money because they have to pay to keep that vehicle on the lot. They're paying interest on it. They're paying parking spot on it. They're paying somebody to service it. When does something break? Because this is the way that it's not sustainable. There's no economic way sustainable. The dealers will rebalance. Like, guess what? We don't want it anymore.
Yes. And I think that's the tricky portion, because this is the bumpy part of the adoption. Because again, we had this conversation in 2021, it would feel completely different. It was like Tesla stock all-time high. Automakers are scrambling to get a part of that. I remember it was before the F-150 Lightning launch. It was just everything looked so bright. And things things change easily. So, it's not as if we were never going to get to a point where this is the tough part of trying to make money. And then also, if you're an automaker, you are seeing this as the end game, especially globally, because it's not just here in the US, even though that's what we're talking about. But you look at other markets in Europe and China, and the success rate of EVs is different there. And so it's eventually the US is going to get on board. The timeline may be longer than, what we think it is right now, but eventually that is the direction. So you really can't afford to get out of the game, because you don't really want to lose your momentum, lose your brand. Just think about, I'd say the truck market. It was all of a sudden, you had Rivian out there, you had Tesla with their Cybertruck. That kind of forced Ford and General Motors' hand, because that's their market. You look at the profitability of those companies, it is in pickup trucks. You take away pickup trucks, those companies look very different. So it's they couldn't afford to not do this, because what if all of a sudden, Tesla with the Cybertruck, we know it's kind of a joke right now, but and Rivian just all of a sudden, became the behemoths in that sector, and what would be the future of those companies. So it's one of those situations where it's we see the future, this is what it looks like. It's going to be rough and bumpy to get there, but you still kind of have to play the game, because you've invested a lot, and a lot of the technologies are being developed. They're on their way. We put a lot of money in especially resources into it. So, I don't know if we're past the point of no return, but it feels like we're fairly close. But especially when you look globally, that looks past the point of no return.
Globally, totally past the point of no return. I look at the global market, the Chinese market, the Beijing Auto Show taking place recently. I don't see how a U.S. manufacturer will be able to, non-Tesla, I'll say that, to penetrate and actually gain significant market share in that market, because the cost structures of the way that they're subsidized in China. And I look at the Norway market. I believe Norway is the largest penetration of electric vehicles in the world.
Yeah.
I am really curious to see in 2 and 3 years, when those vehicles start to come off leash or people trade them in, what happens to them all. Because, we have Redwood, but nobody's really solved the problem when you take an entire country and you start shifting to the next generation. What's going to happen to those? Does those vehicles potentially get shipped to South America? Do they get shipped to other markets? Any insights or thoughts on what happens there?
Yeah, I think your guess is as good as mine as to what happens, because it feels like this is a road that we have not crossed, because not only is the Chinese market has grown so much in volume just, in the past decade or so, that shift to EVs that will be obsolete will be also an interesting transition for them as well. So maybe, yeah, maybe they do get shipped off to different countries. Maybe at some point they are recycled, hopefully to some extent. I mean, just I'm thinking of like a massive cash for clunkers type program could be something that happens that, we have done ourselves, something along those lines. I think it's all probably pretty possible there.
You put a song on my head, now it's going to be stuck in here all day, so I don't mean to put it in your head, but I'm going to put it in your head. 1877 Cars for Kids. Donate your car today.
Yeah. They go to the children.
Yes.
The cars, the old EVs are, that's your first car when you're 16 now across the entire country. They're ready for you.
It could really happen. So Tesla's producing the vehicles profitably. The Chinese, and I'm going to be polite, have opaque accounting rules, so we don't really know the true profitability of those vehicles. We have some insight into BYD, into some of the profitability there. Does this market for electric vehicles really come down to Tesla and Chinese OEMs? If the American and European companies cannot figure out how to make these vehicles profitably, and more importantly, figure out vehicles that consumers want to buy?
Mm-hmm. I think they know the vehicles that consumers want to buy. I think I think the American and the European countries are very good at that. It's just being able to produce those vehicles, in mass at prices that people can afford, I think is probably more of the issue, for them. It is tough, but I mean, have been wild swings in this market, especially, if you look at what Tesla has gone through and, where they are today and the disaster of the earnings call they just had last week. That didn't feel possible, a year ago. So even though we think at this moment it is tough for these other automakers to compete on that level, things do change, and they have a way of figuring it out where they've all been in business for a very long time. When you think of the Detroit automakers as well as the German automakers, they're not new here. And I'm sure they have been looking at and studying what the Chinese have been doing for a very long time. And, so hopefully they're preparing themselves against this. So on the surface, I'd say it's probably easy to dismiss them and be like, yeah, they got no chance. You look at a BYD Seagull, I think it's called, at $10,000. Like, how are you going to compete with that? But not everybody wants it. And when we think back in time as well, it just reminds me of when, Hyundai first came to the United States. I think it was like in 1986. And everyone thought, oh my God, it was like a super cheap Hyundai Excel. You drove it. It seemed unsafe. Nobody liked it. And their reputation suffered for a long time because it was like, oh, Hyundai made cheap cars and we don't like that. And that's not good. And now not all of a sudden, how many years later, 30 years later, their reputation is totally different because they produced vehicles that people wanted, much higher quality vehicles. So cheap doesn't necessarily, I think it gets you market share in the beginning because it's, it's like, oh, wow, I can actually afford this. But it hasn't always proved to be the best long-term strategy for companies, especially that are new to the country, that don't have the brand recognition, and people are naturally going to be weary of it. So even though it seems on paper amazing, I don't know, time will tell on this one, but it's not always that black and white, I think.
Well, Hyundai's now going up market with their Genesis brand. It's priced below a Mercedes, it's priced below BMW, but the build quality is exceptional. They're extremely well-engineered cars.
Right. I mean, I think looking at Hyundai, Kia, and Genesis, all of those cars, you don't really find a lot of fault in them. I mean, the quality is good. It's usually a good value. They give you a lot of content for, not as much money. And that has been their strategy for a long time. And they've come a long way since the Hyundai Excel days. I will say that, it's taken a while, but they're good, compelling vehicles. And they, and we see in the EV market, and we have seen, like even BMW, Audi owners trading them in for Kia and Hyundai EVs, not internal combustion engine vehicles, but we've seen that happen more. So to me, it kind of gives the indication that people are more willing in the EV space to try something new. It seems like brand loyalty is not as strong because the EV market is still in its infancy. And I think that kind of gives automakers a lot of opportunity in this space to take advantage of these customers that are probably just willing to go more towards a vehicle rather than a brand. So I think the idea of brand and the concept of brand will likely evolve, over time, which I think is fairly interesting because it has been very something that just has been a cornerstone of the auto market for so long. It's something that we just have accepted. It feels like that is being challenged quite a bit, or will be challenged with EVs.
That's a very good point, because some individuals consider their car part of their identity. Well, I drive this car; it's part of my identity, which raises what you bring up the really good point. Does software become the differentiating factor? Not necessarily the brand, but the software running in there, the passenger driver experience.
Yeah, and I think consumers will look at it for, how does this vehicle make my life easier? How does it make, just tasks simpler? Do I get more enjoyment out of it? So I think if software helps solve those pain points for consumers, I think that the ownership experience is probably a lot more delightful, and they're likely to tell their friends about it. And, sometimes it's that, one weird feature that people just get hooked on, and then they tell people. I once had, I think it was an Audi, and it was so, I think it's actually quite a common car feature now. You open the door and then the Audi rings project on the ground. And the amount of people that made comments about this, however many years ago, was insane. Like it was like they reinvented the wheel here. It was like to that level. Anyone that had seen it had made a comment about it. But it's just like those little things that stick in people's brain that they're like, oh yeah, I like that. And maybe it doesn't convince anyone to buy an Audi per se, but it definitely catches their attention and is something that they would look into. Because if you can get people to consider your brand, I think that is definitely a win. And if even if it's by because of a silly feature that doesn't cost you anything, that's a win.
We're talking about it today, so it worked.
It did. All these years, this was years ago, and all these years later, I still remember that, it was just like, this is what everyone wants to talk to me about. Okay, sure.
Because the OEMs are very closed guard on software. We've seen the debate, yes to Android Auto, yes to Apple CarPlay, no to Android, no to CarPlay. Does that become a deciding factor for consumers, because their life, for all practical purposes, is on their device, and they don't want to have to go through a clunky UI? They're used to the Android UI, or they're used to the Apple UI.
Yeah, I mean, it could, because people seem to be like, that has grown over time. Is that your loyalty to whatever phone you are using? It seems like it is definitely growing, and it feels like maybe there's less chances to convert consumers nowadays than there once was. It felt like before it was like someone comes out with the cool phone and maybe people would be like, oh, okay, maybe that will sway me to get an Android. Now it feels like you're kind of in one camp or the other, and the camps maybe don't like each other very much. And, there's always talk about, like, when you text message, is it green? Is it blue? I don't like people that are in this color. It's all very confusing. But I can see people, getting, I think that they will want to see like their car as an extension of their phone or their communication systems, however that they decide to use that. So maybe something like that could be a determining factor, but it seems like there's a lot of data laws around that I'm not as familiar with, that makes some of that a bit more complicated. I know automakers wanting to, go it themselves because they don't want to necessarily be on the hook for all of, Apple's rules around, sharing data and privacy and all of that. I think it gets fairly complicated, and it's only going to get more complicated over time. So maybe that just is not the solution for anyone, because it feels like in all the demos that you see from car makers, it's like someone sits, in the future, someone sits in their vehicle, they're not driving it because it's autonomous, it's electric, and you just are saying like, I want to go home. And on the way home, I feel like Chinese food. So, find a Chinese place that's under this much money, and this is what I want to eat, and order it for me. And we're just going to drive by, the car will pick it up, and then I, carry on home. Like that, it seems like that's the end goal here of all of this. And it feels like that's a lot of, a lot of privacy, a lot of data sharing, a lot of information about you that you're going to disclose, even in that very innocuous example, that, there probably is growing concern about all that information and where it goes, and, what you're doing in your vehicle and the places that you visit. It feels very, like we're not quite there yet, but it feels like there's going to be a lot of concern around that, privacy concerns.
There is. I've said it for years. I think you're going to have a lot of privacy concerns around the vehicle. I think one, you're right. The in-vehicle monitoring, the voice, the camera, breath, whatever sensors were in there. Then you're going to have outside the vehicle. Why is my vehicle gathering all this data? And I go back. There's a court case for this when I say this. There's a court case to prove this. Mm-hmm. Somebody's having an affair, gets picked up on a car camera, and that car company gets subpoenaed, that car gets subpoenaed, and the lawyer gets the data off there, and this person proves that they had an affair, and they get a divorce. It's happened on Ring cameras. It's happened on Nest cameras outside of houses. It's going to happen with a car. Then you're going to have a whole new can of worms that's going to open. And as cars become, let's call it, they become moving cameras, which they already are today, you're going to have some privacy reforms around it. It's going to be really interesting to see how it revolves. And then I also look at the economic side of this. Can a consumer opt in to share their data and get paid, or opt out and not get paid? And that becomes interesting. And then how does that affect the economics of the vehicle? I'll share my data and you'll lower my lease payment by X dollars because they're making money on all that data. Somebody's going to chirp up on that one day. And I'm surprised that it really hasn't happened yet. Because if you look at this high interest rate environment, especially around mortgages, around 7.75%, 8%, and you got the interest rates are driving car payments to the roof. Is that causing any slowdown in the market with these high interest rates where consumers are like, well, I'm not leasing that. This car used to be $600. Now it's $850. Is that slowing down the market at all?
Oh, yes. I mean, I feel like you have seen the emails I got because that's exactly the concern that we hear. It's like, I'm turning in my lease. I'm just going to lease the same thing as I have done a few cycles now. And all of a sudden the same vehicle is $200-$300 more a month. That's ridiculous. Why is that? And I know that's caused a lot of contention at dealerships too, that customers are just completely blindsided. I mean, I think that the narrative of high interest rates is definitely settled into people's brain because we know high interest rates, inflation, all of those things. But to this degree of how much different it is, I think that sometimes is a surprise because, you're right. Interest rates on a new vehicle over 7%, on used vehicle over 11% on average. And that drives new vehicle monthly payments, in the $750 range. And that's a lot. I mean, some people, in some areas are like $750. That's like, that's a rent check or used to be a rent check. Probably rents have gone up as well. But that has definitely been, an area in which there's so much concern and has, quite frankly, slowed the market down because there's, in a kind of an era where we didn't see a lot of incentives because of the inventory shortage plus growing interest rates. The deals that consumers are used to and have been conditioned to see in the auto market just aren't there. And I think that's what's shocking because this industry's always been about deals. There's always been too much inventory and that has changed. And it's like a new normal for consumers and they find it quite shocking.
Are consumers either they turn their lease in, not leasing, and say, all right, we're going to go to a one-car family, and we'll use Uber to supplement it. Are you seeing any data like that? Because you can ride around in an Uber for less than you can, depending on how far you go with one car, than having a second car payment, not to mention the insurance expenditure, which has gone up. I just blew my mind. I read the insurance data, 22% year over year average United States increase in the cost of auto insurance. Mm-hmm. Wowzerville.
Auto insurance is through the roof. And I've heard this story and I've seen it personally. I think I called my insurance agent. I was like, did we go to like from monthly to quarterly payments? Like what happened? And he was like, no, we didn't. And I was like, wow. I was like, I didn't realize that a teenage boy destroyed my family because they're that high now. But yeah, I mean, that's an interesting development that has been relatively new is that, people all of a sudden are shocked when they are seeing how much it costs to insure a vehicle because you have vehicles that are more expensive now. So it's probably more than last time that you got car insurance, and then insurance costs alone have gone up much. So the equation of owning a vehicle is quite expensive. I mean, we did see people downsize, but I think a lot of that had to do with people not going into the office, during kind of the heart of the pandemic. So I think now that everything is open and more people are going back into the office, I feel like it's a bit harder to exist perhaps as a one car family. But I think that there are people that definitely do the math, especially in places where maybe transportation is a little bit easier, to see if that whole Uber equation could work. I mean, it is a bit challenging, but yeah, when you do the math, I think it could get quite scary. The total cost of ownership.
And then there's the layoff factor. The layoffs are accelerating. So you factor in layoffs, loss of income, increasing insurance premiums. Are you seeing any data where consumers are just turning over the keys and walking away from the vehicle and say, guess what, we're done? Are you seeing any data of that yet?
Not necessarily. I mean, I probably wouldn't get that type of data. I don't know if we're just talking about people that are just walk away from their car completely or just gets repossessed. I think that probably is something different. But what we have seen historically is that people need at least one vehicle because they need that transportation to get to wherever it is they have to go, whether it's one per family, one per person, they need that vehicle. So generally payments are made for vehicles, even if they go without, utility payments, home payments, because that stuff is a bit harder. You can't just have a repossession truck kind of driving around and repossess your house. That just, it's a bit of a longer process there. So we do see people generally make those payments. But I mean, you could feasibly see this growing concern of, people really looking at crunching the numbers right now, especially, with wages not necessarily going up, keeping up with where inflation is, because it feels like everywhere you go now, you're spending so much money. It's like, I just say you just have to stay in your house. You leave the house, it's $50 minimum wherever it is you're going. So it's it's hard to even, cost down, because every area of your life is so much more expensive than it used to be.
Just go to the grocery store. Everybody says, well, inflation's not bad. Go to the grocery store. And then they're up grocery prices are up 8% year over year. They're not declining. It's one of the stickiest parts of inflation. You're seeing the St. Louis Fed put out delinquency data, which is really scary, getting past that 90-day mark with auto vehicles. And I'm really worried about the market. The Fed did not publish the amount of vehicles. They were saying that they are starting to see delinquencies higher than 2008. So if you take in a depressed EV market, you take in repossessions, you take in Hertz dumping 30,000 vehicles, you're going to continue to have downward pressure. Does that open the door then for consumers to maybe try and get something on a bargain? Say, hey, look at this. The market's flooded. I got my $20,000 car. Maybe did we see an uptick on that if the economy continues to force the prices downwards?
Yeah, I mean, we see that especially with the used car market. And people are looking, are kind of forced into older models and, more mileage. Because before it was okay, if you're a near new shopper, you're looking at something off lease, you're looking for something under 40,000 miles, under $25,000. And there was sort of quite a few options in that category. Now we're seeing that same person, they just have to go older. They're looking at 5 years, 7 years, more miles on their vehicle. And, they're having to make the concessions that way. It's not necessarily a popular choice. I don't think people like to do that, but it's what people have been forced into because prices have just, have gone up so much. And, even looking at some of the, used inventory, we kind of see what's going to happen there. We're at the point where not too long ago, 3 years ago, it's leases fell off a cliff. There's, so that those lease return populations aren't coming back. We know that the new car sale rate was lower than it has been starting in 2020. So it's you have to have a new car before you have a used car. Inventory concerns, I think, in that market are definitely, real. So the idea that you can buy an affordable car is there in the used market. But I think even some of that is, I think we're looking at that with a bit trepidation moving forward.
We're in uncertain times. The Fed potentially could actually raise interest rates again this year. It's on the table, depending on where it goes. And then that gets really scary for the economy and really scary for the auto market. With that backdrop in place, how do you see the car market shaking out over the next 12 to 18 months?
I mean, it's definitely going to be, tough because I think, interest rates are such an important part of this market. I mean, you look at how people shop, they're just looking at monthly payments. Sometimes people, they're not even concerned at how much it costs and how much it costs totally. They're just oh, what is that monthly payment? And that automatically assumes interest rates. And that is really the tough part. I mean, the good news that we are seeing for consumers, not necessarily not for automakers, is the fact that there has been a reintroduction of a lot of incentive programs. So the fact that there are subsidized loan programs is extremely helpful for consumers, and it will get a lot more interest from consumers because I'd say pre-COVID, you had a 0% finance deal for 60 months. It kind of fell on deaf ears because it was so abundant. People saw those messages everywhere. Now you have a 0% for 60 months. All of a sudden, you're probably going to get a lot of new customers. It's going to be a costly incentive program for you personally, but that is sort of the cue that consumers are looking for. So we know that the market is definitely going to be tough, but the fact that inventory has improved a lot and we are seeing more incentives, that's going to help things out a little bit. I mean, if we were in a situation with bad inventory and the macro, climate, what it is, that would be, even more concerning. But, the fact that things have gotten a little better on the supply side is definitely making the equation a bit easier.
It'll be interesting to see how the incentives roll out. I'll be watching. Thank you for that insight, Jessica. This has been a really insightful conversation. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. For today, what would you like our listeners to take away with them?
Well, I feel like we've been a bit negative on EVs this whole time. So I would say that although we, in my personal opinion, it's definitely going to be slow getting over this hurdle that we are currently seeing. But I do think that eventually, we will overcome it. And I feel like it is, for the most part, where we're going to go, in the long term. So while I feel like we have maybe been, a bit harsh, we do expect some growth. I don't think it's going to be negative. It's just, I think with any new technology, there's so many X factors involved. There's so many players. There's so much opportunity. It just becomes such a cloudy, muddy space, and you key on what you hear in some of the big headlines, but the market is just so much bigger than that. And, consumers are so much more complex than that. So, I do feel optimistic, even though perhaps I sound a bit negative on it sometimes.
You weren't negative. You gave honest market realities. That's the current state of the market today. It's not rosy. What you clearly stated today was the truth of where the market is. The market's going to change. Mr. Market does his job. Markets are a voting machine. That goes up, it goes down. Same thing's going to happen with electric. It's going to take off. It's going to slow down.
Right.
And vice versa.
Yeah.
But EVs will play a very large role in the future. How large a percentage? I don't know. I'm not going to make a guess, but they will play a large role in the future of transportation. Today is tomorrow. Tomorrow is today. The future is a healthy and vibrant car market. Jessica, thank you so much for coming on SAE Tomorrow Today.
Thank you so much for having me. I had a great time.
Thank you for listening to SAE Tomorrow Today. If you've enjoyed this episode and would like to hear more, please kindly rate, review, and let us know what topics you'd like for us to explore next.
SAE International makes no representations as to the accuracy of the information presented in this podcast. The information and opinions are for general information only. SAE International does not endorse, approve, recommend, or certify any information, product, process, service, or organization presented or mentioned in this podcast.